Well, thank you very much, Andrea, for the invitation. Thank you, everyone, for being here. We've got a tough week behind us and another tough week ahead of us. But this is what we're trying to do right now to make sure, as Andrea was saying, that that the world is ready to have Argentina back. I remember a couple of months ago in our first G20 appearance, one thing I mentioned then was that G20 is no longer G19, that a prodigal son has returned, and there was even applause for that sentence. I mean, amongst central bankers and finance ministers. I mean, you don't get that, but we got it. And the reason why we do that is not only because we like you guys very much, but also because we believe that by doing that, it's going to be better for us. Of course, what's making the headlines today is the news from the New York Court of Appeal yesterday, which was quite shocking. 12 hours before the hearing, our lawyers had told us that there was a 5% chance of us getting a resolution from the bench, and so we got the 95% of the thing in yesterday's decision, which was quite good, and everyone outside of Argentina is excited about it. Most people inside of Argentina too, because they finally understood that it was a significant waste of time, energy, jobs, growth to be disconnected from the world for so many years. We've actually, come up with a calculation what it meant since Judge Griset's first judgment on September 2011. It cost Argentina more than $120 billion worth of savings that did not stay, investments that did not come, or payments that were made for no other reason that we didn't have access to the market. The previous administration, just for me to make sure that you understand, called this desendeudamiento. But in fact, what it was lack of credit, and therefore we were the only country in the world that would be paying cash because there was no credit card we could draw upon. That probably would have meant, if those resources would have been deployed in a different manner into our country, it would have meant 2 million jobs that we now don't have. I mean, 2 million jobs that were never created just because, a bunch of people running the country back then thought it was such a better idea to claim that by not paying, they were doing the country a service. Oddly enough, what this deal does is we're paying the exact amount that the previous administration had in their books for overdue debts that were not paid in 2005. This has significant, of course, impact and throughout not only Argentina but throughout the region. We were discussing this in the I don't know where Raúl is, but during the IDB meetings over the weekend. Just a simple, credit rating arithmetics with regards to Argentina and the impact of what we've done or what we haven't done over the last few years around the region. The day Argentina gets a credit rating back, which is going to be very soon, hopefully next week when we issue the new bond, that will mean that the IDB or the IDB's capital will increase by nearly $2 billion just because we're no longer in selective default. $2 billion worth of capital for the IDB means probably $8 billion worth of loans. $8 billion worth of loans is almost 1 year worth of IDB loans to the rest of the region. There you have it. It's not because of you that we do it, it's because of us, but it's got great implications on the rest of the region, a region that is quite shaken right now, as you all know. So we are very happy to take the baton, as Andrea was saying, and I wouldn't say lead the pack, but at least be the spotlight of attraction as we seem to be right now. we're all very excited about, the Court of Appeal's decision yesterday. And I think we should be, because this clears the way for, making the payment and putting this thing behind. But I believe the critical date on this saga was March 31st. This was the time when Congress finally approved the law that will allow us to make the payment. And I can see two lawmakers here in the first row. We're very thankful. These are from our side. But the odd thing about the vote, particularly on March 31st in the Senate, we got 54 votes out of 72 seat chamber. So that's 75% of the vote, and I repeat, 75% of the vote for leaving default behind and for paying to the holdouts. You must know that in that chamber we only have 19 seats. If, pushing it a little bit, we can get to 19 seats. So that means that 35 of those 54 votes came from forces other than the official coalition. And more interestingly even, we had more votes in favor of the law from Frente para la Victoria than we had from Cambiemos. And Frente para la Victoria were the guys who told you that they would never, ever even come close to eventually thinking that they could possibly pay out to the holdouts. So things do change. And when President Macri was saying, yes, we can, and you've heard that one as well, he really meant it. And not because he thought it was a good idea, because he knew, and we knew, that change was what people in Argentina were asking for. And this is my key message today. It's not that Macri one day woke up and said, wow, this is a great idea. It's not that he's got like good-looking ministers or something that some people say. But it's basically that people want to change. The Argentine people want to leave the past experience behind. So I think you shouldn't underestimate the fact that these senators, most of which were from the previous official party, from the Frente para la Victoria, voted for this law. And the one thing that I like most, and I'm going to run into trouble if I keep repeating this, but I will again. One chap out of those 54 guys was the very Adolfo Rodríguez Sá. I'm sorry to say this, but I've got to say it. Adolfo Rodríguez Sá was the provisional president of the nation in early 2002, who decreed the default of all our debts to a standing ovation in that very same building, the building of the Congress of the Nation. So if it were about cleansing, if you will, it had to be done this way. And it was done this way. And we wanted it to be done that way. And that's why we worked very hard, not only in the New York courts, but also at home, securing the support from the different parties. We had a hectic session in the House. This was a 19-article law, and we took modifications to 11 out of those 19 articles, and we think because of that the law is actually better than what it was when we sent it. That in itself is kind of science fiction for the Argentine Congress. You don't do these things, you just send the law and expect for everyone to sign off on it. So this is also not just what was done, but also most significantly the way it was done in Congress that needs to be taken into account to understand where is Argentina coming from and where Argentina is headed to. Andrea mentioned the INDEC, and I'm so happy that he mentioned the National Statistics Institute. Because in some newspapers it goes sort of undercover, the fact that we are revamping the National Statistics Institute. This was an institute that for over 8 years spent a significant amount of money and resources and payroll basically to lie about what was going on. And then, we're now finding out whether there was a methodology problem or whatever. But at the end of the day, what happened was that what was being gauged was completely different from what was being actually reported. And this is a discussion that we'll have, you mentioned the point, Andrea, we'll have these days with the fund. There's a lot of backward looking to be done with that regard, but we just look forward as well. We, as you mentioned, we decreed the national statistics emergency, which is a novelty as well. I mean, you don't quite know what that is, but it means that Jorge Todesca, the guy in charge of the Statistics Institute, is really in charge. He does not need to ask for my permission for anything he decides upon, be it on the payroll, be it on the admin side, be it on the data calendar, be it on the methodology issues or whatever. I don't even want to know about Jorge Todesca. Let him do his own thing. And I think this is very important as well, because it's not just, honoring our debts and, doing what we had to do. It's also telling the truth. And the one thing I'm sure it's hitting your minds when you look at this Argentine chap is, well, these were the guys that were lying to us for so many years. Well, we're not going to do that anymore. And more importantly, we're not going to do that to ourselves. I mean, because, you guys can look at us and say, well, whatever. But we've got to take charge and take responsibility for that. And it's so hard to run a country with not knowing what's going on, basically. It was very easy, of course, for the previous administration because they could set the target and the gauge and the result, therefore. So it was so easy to make it, in a way. But we went the hard route, and in fact, many of the measures that this administration has taken over the first 120 days were not easy decisions. And we know that in most cases, they are the type of decision of short-run pain, medium-run gain. And we knew that it had to be done in the first 100 days, because otherwise it would not have been done. And we are very cognizant of the fact that some of the measures that we've taken need to be compensated for with additional measures, particularly for the poor. We've taken quite a few of those measures already. We are ready to take a few more to make sure that in this sequencing game of going in the right direction, hitting the right buttons, but also being aware that there are hurdles along the way, and looking up, but also looking down, such that you don't fall into a big pozo or something. We are sort of tweaking around, and we are, as I said before, very cognizant of the fact that the economy has not yet recovered, that some of the price adjustments that we needed to do are having some bearing on the most vulnerable, and in that regard, we are spending fiscal resources. We're going to be making some further announcements in that regard. Those resources are already incorporated in our own budget, in our own fiscal projections. They will amount to around 1 point of GDP. It's a massive fiscal effort for a country or for an administration who received a legacy of a fiscal deficit of around 6 points of GDP. But it's got to be done. I know many people outside of Argentina say, well, these guys, they're saying the right things, but they should be more swift and they should probably bring the deficit down faster. And the answer to that is yes, but. And the but is we've got to take into account the social and the political constraints that we're dealing with. As I said before, we show majorities in neither of the two chambers in Congress. We received a legacy in which 1 out of 3 Argentines are living below the poverty line. So it would be great to do it, overnight, but it's not going to happen overnight. We're not taking the gradual path just because we belong to the international school of gradualism. We're taking the gradual path because it's the only feasible path. And alongside that only feasible path, putting our house in order with the New York court was critical, because our local capital markets is this tiny, this small. We're gonna need, credit and financial resources for our many infrastructure projects, but also to cover up for some deficit over the coming years. And the only way to bring those deficit numbers down gradually without affecting the poor was, getting a resolution to this issue as soon as it was possible. By the way, when we started off with this adventure, because it's so complex, there are so many ups and downs. I mean, it's been a roller coaster. One day you were extremely happy about how that day had gone by. The next day you were not that happy. The following day you were very unhappy. But finally it's all coming into place. And when we started off, there was one survey in Wall Street that they basically asked the experts, when do you think is the most likely timing for Argentina to sort this thing out? And on average, the responses were December 2016. It seems that we're going to be able to do it 8 months before time, and we're happy for that. We're not necessarily happy for the fact that this was a mess. It was badly run. It shouldn't have been such a bill, and we would have liked to have paid a lot less if the previous administration had not been a mess regarding this particular issue. But we got that. We had to sort it out. We got an extremely favorable deal for our country, taking into account that this was not voluntarily restructuring of debt, but rather facing a sentence that was final and facing, a few guys who are very tough, who had, this sentence in their favor, and who had to give away, on average, more than 30% of their claim. So I think it was finally the deal that could be done in very little time, and it's the deal that will put that past behind us. It's almost as if all that we've done so far is the preheating work. We're desperate to move on to the field, and it's we're getting there, kind of thing. But we had to sort some of these things out before we could actually entrar a la cancha, get to the field. And get to the field means that we are paving the ground for the private sector to be up to the challenge again. There's been a lot of disinvestment, not just in the public but also in the private sector over the last few years. Argentina is the most unleveraged economy in the emerging market world, and probably in the world, which happens to be a good thing now that everyone is looking into emerging market corporate debt and how it blew up over the last few years and so forth. Funny that no one is looking into central bank debt, but I leave that one for, you had the Italian guy earlier, so I'm sure he had some views about that. But basically, one number that I think you should remember is when you look at the emerging market universe or space, corporate debt with respect to GDP is around 110% on average. You take China away from that computation, and it comes down a bit, of course, around 80%. You take everything else but Latin America, so that you look at Latin America, and it's around 65%. Argentina is not even 20%. So all I'm saying is, this is another measure of how many investments were actually not made during the previous decade, not just from the public sector, but also the private sector. And what we're trying to do here is to lay the groundwork for the public sector to have the role and because this is where jobs will be coming from. Only the public sector can only do a little bit. There was a lot done over the last few years. It's now the time for the private sector to come up to the fore and do that. And this is why it's so important for us to come to this to these type of fora. Again, I'll mention the IDB meeting over the weekend. Of course, we had the spotlight, and we had a few presentations to make, and a lot of back patting and great, you guys are doing blah blah blah. But the really important thing about the IDB meetings in Bahamas over the weekend was that we had 100 Argentine businessmen walking around the different rooms and having meetings with their counterparties and striking already credit lines and potential business in any sector that you can think of. Energy sector, traditional and non-traditional, renewables, infrastructure, agriculture, you name it. It's not just that you guys are excited or the financial sector is excited. There's an excitement that runs deeper, and the excitement comes from the fact that everyone and his aunt knows that Argentina was completely derailed for so many years. The opportunity is true. I mean, there is this opportunity. What we're trying to do is to make sure that we maximize the benefits of the opportunity, and that we can bring it forward such that it comes the sooner, and of course the sooner the better. There are many other areas that I could speak of. Do I have more minutes? Do I go to the fray?
You will have the question.
I'll have my stint with my good friend here at the Financial Times. Basically, the idea here is Argentina is back. As I said before, I thank most people for their patience over the last few years, as I thanked my colleagues at G20. It is for us our honor to be spearheading this process, and we do it not for the bronze, but rather for our people. There's no way Argentina can be back into the growth path, or even shooting at development project, if we are fully disconnected from the world. I mean, it's sad that we have to actually mention it, but that's the way it is. And this is my message today. Argentina is back, and I hope you can enjoy it. Thank you.